Calling the meeting to order at 5:01. We have one informational item this evening. And Mr. Steele, can we get the presentation queued up? Okay, please note the presence of the commissioners on the committee at the Augmented Ad Hoc Committee to revise board operating procedures, both committee members and commissioners in attendance.
Noted.
And we will reserve 10 minutes for public comment at the beginning of this meeting with 1 minute each. Is there anybody in the public that would like to make a comment at this time? Right. Seeing none, we are ready to move on, and we will begin the presentation. All right, so Judson, can we move on to slide 2, please? This committee and tonight's meeting are part of a broader effort to improve how this board governs. The 7 board commissioners are committed to improving our behaviors and practices to improve student outcomes. In fact, the photo that you see shows the hands of all 7 board members. How school boards operate matters. Specifically, this involves how the board interacts with each other, how the board runs meetings, where the board focuses its attention, how the board and superintendent work with each other, and how the board engages with the community. All of these things impact the community's trust in the board. If a board operates effectively, research shows it is more likely to improve student outcomes. Historically, the SFUSD board has not prioritized the way it operates. This is changing. Operating effectively is particularly challenging given that it requires the cooperation and coordination of 7 independent commissioners. Having a clear set of operating procedures that all 7 commissioners agree to follow increases the board's likelihood of effectiveness in these areas. We don't have to agree on everything, but it's in students' best interest if we do agree on how to work together. On June 28th, the board unanimously paused all standing committees so that it may devote the board's time and attention to creating the conditions to improve student outcomes. Concurrently, President Lamb impaneled this ad hoc committee to revise the board's operating procedures. The committee will have until September 1st to finalize and share its recommendations for approval by the board. The committee will disband after September 1st unless extended by the full board. Unlike the standing committees that have been temporarily paused, this ad hoc committee is directly related to our efforts to improve our board practices. The public may also be aware of a separate effort whereby the board is drafting its vision, values, goals, and guardrails for the district and creating a community engagement plan to gather feedback. This ad hoc committee's purpose is different and distinct from those efforts. Next slide, please. Our approach to improving governance is premised on 2 beliefs. School systems exist to improve student outcomes, and student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. Next slide. So how will this committee work? While we reserve the right to modify this process at any time, here's how we envision the work. The first meeting tonight, we will begin by brainstorming about what optimal board member behavior would be in a variety of challenging and/or commonly recurring situations. Based on notes from this session, AJ Crable and the Council of the Great City Schools team will draft policy language, and the SFUSD legal team will review for compliance with state law. The reviewed rough draft will be sent to committee members, the full board 7 calendar days prior to the second meeting, and will also be posted at that time for the public. Any recommended edits from the committee members or our fellow commissioners should be submitted to AJ Crable and his team no later than 72 hours prior to the second meeting. As always, the public can submit comments in writing and will have the opportunity to comment in person as well at our meeting. Our second meeting, August 3rd, we will review the recommended edits that were submitted by the deadline and consider which edits to retain. The consultant team will then make another round of revisions and send it to committee members, and 7 days prior to the August 24th meeting. This will be shared with all commissioners and also be posted for the public. The third and last planned meeting, August 24th, the committee will review the updated rough draft and the existing policy crosswalk as source documents for approving the final recommendation that we will submit for the full board's consideration. Next slide, please. So our scope is limited to communication, board meeting and agendas, addressing concerns. Any other topics will not be discussed by this committee. All right, next slide. Oh, and we will also have a parking lot if there are items that come up that we'd like to address later at a future date, and we will make note of those. So here's what we will cover in communication. It's communication between board members and between board members and fellow board members and the community, board members and staff who do report to the board, and board members and staff who do not report to the board. Next slide, please. This is the scope we will be discussing as far as meetings and agenda. We will discuss the annual calendar and monitoring calendar, which items aren't eligible to be addressed during board meetings, how items are added to the board meeting agenda, the timeline for preparing a board meeting for both staff and board members, design of board meetings include length, focus, purpose, non-purpose, and so forth, and design requirements of committees and committee meetings and any bodies impaneled by the board. Next slide, please. Here is what's in the scope regarding addressing concerns. When board members have concerns about behavior of staff members who do not report to the board, or concerns about staff members who do report to the board, or other board members. Next slide, please. AJ Grable, as mentioned, from the Council of the Great City Schools, will facilitate tonight's meeting and subsequent 2 meetings. I am chairing this committee, and I am very, very thankful to have the wisdom of 2 colleagues, Commissioner Bogus and Commissioner Sanchez. Only the 3 members of this ad hoc committee will have a say in the final recommendation coming out of the committee. Non-committee board members and Superintendent Wayne are also here, and we love that you are here, Commissioner Weissman-Ward, and I believe we have 2 commissioners joining online as well. 3 commissioners, so we've got a full board participating or watching.
Excuse me, Chair.
Oh,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
We didn't agendize that we would have members participating via teleconference, so they can speak as like during public comment, but they can't participate as they usually would on an augmented committee showing up in person.
Okay, all right. So should I make note, or did you just make note of that?
I'm just making note if you wanted to reopen public comment.
Oh, sure.
So that they could, and other people have arrived.
Sure. So we are doing public.
They can participate as public comment like anyone else, but they can't participate as members of the board because they weren't agendaed to do that.
Oh, the board members, correct.
Right.
Yes,
right.
And that is understood.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Wait.
Point of clarification. Do they need to, we have too many mics on. Point of clarification. Do we need to have them go to attendee status, or can they still sit at panelists as long as they're not participating?
I think we can trust them not to interject.
Okay.
But they would only participate during speak during public comment the same amount as anyone else.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we will all conclude the presentation, and then we will reopen for public comment at the conclusion of the presentation. All right. So facilitated by AJ Crable. Hold on just a moment now. Okay. To stay focused, so our non-committee board members will participate in public comment just as our public commenters would do. We're doing this so we can move to action more quickly. It's also an exercise in trusting that we can work separately but still toward a shared purpose. And I just want to say thank you to my fellow commissioners and the public and our superintendent for your openness to try new practices and your flexibility as we move forward with this work. I would also like to thank Board Liaison Judson Steele and our legal counsel, Angie Miller, for supporting the work of this committee and for their superhuman patience as we figure this all out. General Counsel Hauk is on vacation and we anticipate her direct involvement as well. I also want to acknowledge that the committee's work affects our staff as well as the board, and I appreciate their support and will also seek their input as we move forward with this process. We're aiming to spend no more than 2 hours in tonight's meeting. This is driven by having only 2 hours of AJ Crable's time and the need to get to decisions quickly. We're complying with the Brown Act, so our work is done in public. So I think this is that the final slide, or is there? Okay, so yeah, there's additional information on our on the website as posted, and this committee has a very narrow window in which to accomplish important work. It will feel quick and it might be uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable, but we do have an abundance of evidence that what this board has historically done has not worked. We don't need to study the problem for 6 months. I have confidence that we can make significant improvements in a short amount of time. So with that, I will open to public comment.
As the chair, you can make it longer than 2 minutes.
Okay, so why don't we do, I'll open to public comment. I was aiming for, let's say, 15 minutes total, 2 minutes each. And so will the comments be, sorry, legal counsel. So the comments, are we just taking commissioner comments online or are we opening up for?
I would reopen it for the public in general.
All right, so let's start with, can we do 8 minutes? Okay, all right. How about 10 minutes in person and 10 minutes for online comments, 1 minute each?
Here.
All right, so with that, if there's anybody here in person that would like to make comments, please step forward and
Strongly encouraged.
we'd love to hear from you. You are more than welcome. All right, seeing none, I will move to our online participants and offer 10 minutes of online comment for anyone wishing to participate.
Thank you. You said 2 minutes, correct?
2 minutes each.
Go ahead, Alita.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for holding this meeting. I appreciate all the work that everyone is doing over the summer. And I have great concerns about this timeline over the summer. As you know, summer is a time when everyone is, after the hardest school year we've had on record, everyone is resting, recovering, and recharging their batteries. And there is a lot of information that those of us in the joint advisory committees and many other stakeholders would love to share with you to inform this process as it moves forward. And the timeline that you have presented here seems a little too tight for us to be able to do that when everyone's working either on vacation hours, shortened schedules, or frankly not even coming back until August. So I look forward on behalf of the joint advisory committees to working with you in this process. And I would also strongly encourage you to re-examine the timeline to ensure that you have feedback from all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. The handle says teacher.
Yes, I am very, very concerned with the pacing of this. This just seems very rushed, like there's just not enough voice, diversity of voice from families, from educators. So I would like us to slow down the pace of this. Thank you.
Can you state your name?
My name is Sergeant Smith.
Thank you. Lawrence?
Hi, thank you, commissioners. This is an incredible meeting, as was Sunday's. I'm super pleased of this effort and recognize that it's completely different than how things are run. Thank you so much for the facilitators' work this last Sunday, and very excited to see the commitment to this effort going forward, with the caution that people would love to see feedback in this ambitious timeframe, and people would love to see action. So we're not going to let you off the hook. Just kidding. This is going to be nice. But we really, I think that people I've talked to really appreciate the direction that this last meeting and this meeting is going on. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam?
Hi, my name is Sam. I wanted to just talk a minute about my personal experience in trying to do outreach at our school at Buena Vista Horace Mann. As you know, we were in the middle of a renovation and trying to get a lot of community input. And I just want to say there's a lot of difficulty, even though our school is very close knit and communicates a lot with each other. Getting parent input is practically very difficult. We have to not only put out surveys online, but also meet people at the gates and try and engage them when they're dropping off their children. It's a little easier with elementary parents. And we have the language barriers sometimes, as well as we're sort of asking teachers to help us with WhatsApp, like text threads. There's a lot of different things just to get our little community to give proper feedback. And the idea that this timeline would work on a practical level, I'm just having a very hard time visualizing how that works. And I'd like to think that the principal and teacher on our board would sort of see how that happens. And this is a big hurdle. And I just want to say I'm very concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Forgive me if I mispronounce Elon or Elon.
Aaronstein, hi. Good evening. My name is actually Regina Pasunkova. Elon is my husband. My question is regarding the virtual academy. I know that the board voted not to offer the virtual academy program in the 2022 to 2023.
I'm sorry. We are only taking comments on the agenda item this evening about the board considering the change of their policies moving forward. Board operating procedures. So that's the only thing you can speak to tonight.
Oh, okay. Understood. I apologize.
Right. No problem. Thank you. Looks like Commissioner Shu is the only hand left up. You can go ahead, Commissioner Shu.
Okay. Hi, fellow board members. I was hoping to participate, but having been informed that you three are the ones who are going to be doing all the brainstorming, I'm fully confident that you have a lot more experience than me in engaging all these different communications issues. So I just want to say thank you for doing the yeoman's work on behalf of us. So go for it. Looking forward to your brainstorm and giving you some feedback afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you for the public comments. And now I will hand it over to our facilitator, AJ Crable.
Good evening. All right, committee members, we've got a lot of work to do and not a lot of time to get it done with, so we're going to dive right in. The way this will work is I'll continue to just surface topic after topic. Myself, members of my team will be taking notes. And so all you have to do is just be responsive to the inquiries, essentially for each topic that committee chair already lifted up. We're just going to walk through them one by one. And what I'll just be asking you is, what are the things that you think should take place? It may be similar to what's currently in your procedures and policies. It may be very different. None of that matters. Your only task tonight is just to think through, for each of these topical areas, what do you think makes the most sense? Some of this will be informed by prior experience. Some of this will be just informed by conversations we've had over the past few months. The first topic is communications. And so we'll dive directly into communications with community. As you think about what type of guidelines should be in place and that really govern how board members do and don't communicate with community, what comes to mind? The floor is open.
I would say for me, one of the things that comes to mind is there's a gap of responsiveness. Like people come to the board because all the other avenues they kind of have gone down have led to like dead ends. And they kind of see us as kind of like the emergency lever to kind of make things happen to protect their child, their child's education, or things in their school community.
Likewise, I would like to see the ability for commissioners to respond consistently in an informed manner when there is a issue or a concern that comes to us from the community, and that there's a clear connection to where within the district that would be handled and owned.
I agree. I think that the board historically has gotten lots of communication from community over many, many different topics of concern, and sometimes very rarely, though, of praise for what the district's doing or what the board's doing. I think that every board member handles the communication in a different way. So I'm interested in hearing, and thinking as well about how we can streamline how we respond. And one way I think in essence, a board member on his or her own self doesn't really have the power or capacity to make any changes and deal with a certain problem at a certain school site. We need to have a through line to the superintendent so that the superintendent can then address it with the designated person or persons in his staff.
I guess the other area is two-way communication. Currently, the board meetings, and I know we talked about this on Sunday as far as going into community, but as far as like a clear commitment and understood ways where community members know that there's ways to have two-way communication with board members in the district outside of our board meetings or outside of emailing by means of escalation when things aren't resolved or when there's just issues that they would like to bring to our attention.
And I guess there's like a historical communication gap, I feel like, where people aren't aware of things that we've done or policies that exist that either are being implemented or aren't being implemented. And it kind of creates a dynamic where people are finding out things that sometimes are true, sometimes aren't true, and don't really have a way to kind of differentiate or kind of understand the dynamics behind things. And I'd also just say a big part of our communications challenge this moment, I think, is also related to kind of like a trust gap where people like lacking trust in institutions and the things that we say and are kind of waiting to see if we're committed or honest or being fibbers.
And then the last thing that I can think of around communication is proactive communication from the board when we have taken, when we're demonstrating that we have heard from community. I feel like part of that loop doesn't get closed when people come to us, even if something gets resolved, or something gets modified because we've heard things from the public. It's not necessarily communicated back or updated in any sort of regular way or easy to find way.
Any other reflections on the topic of communication between the board members, and the community?
I don't feel like we have good internal systems to support like board member communication. I think for the most part, we just get warnings from lawyers about talking to each other and breaking the law, but not like really good systems to support meeting coordination or really ways to kind of make sure we're sharing the knowledge that we're kind of gaining through our visits to school sites or conversations with families. And so I think figuring out more institutional ways to create legal and appropriate conversation and dialogue amongst the board would be helpful.
All right, a couple of follow-up questions on this section before we move on. There were a few comments around community members using board members as a vehicle for addressing concerns. A few of you made the point that the board actually doesn't have the authority to address most of the concerns. And so you were wondering what was the system for pushing feedback from community members to board members on to the superintendent. A question I have for you. Is that what you intend? Should feedback from the community that comes to board members always go to the superintendent?
No, I don't know if it should always, but I think in most occasions it should, especially if it's a concern that community members have at their school site or something to do with the district that, as I said earlier, individual board members don't have the capacity nor the authority to actually handle. And so I think it's our duty to then forward it along to our superintendent, and then the superintendent has the staff address the concern.
So if a community member comes to you with a concern about their teacher, that should go to the superintendent?
I would say that I would ask the person to then go through to the principal first, if they haven't done that.
Okay, so then they go to the principal, and if the community member has a problem with the principal, that should go to the superintendent?
I would want the superintendent to be aware of that, yes.
Do the principals in your district have supervisors?
Yes, they do.
Why would it go to the superintendent, not the principal supervisor?
Well, I mean, it could. I just think that a lot of community members don't have that access to know who that person is. And then if they don't trust in the system, then they don't know how to address the person who's the supervisor, then I think they're stuck.
Got it. So how should board members know whether to redirect into the system or send to the superintendent? Because when I asked you if they have a concern with their teacher, he's like, no, that shouldn't go to the superintendent. So what is the reliable and consistent understanding the board members should have? And this is for anybody. This isn't just a Mark and I conversation. What is the reliable delineation that all board members should use to know whether we're redirecting people back to the appropriate location in the school system versus escalating it to the superintendent? And that's for anybody.
Yeah, no, I would respond. I think for me, in my mind, if it is an issue that is at its beginning point, is when, in my mind, I'm trying to figure out if there's channels and avenues at the school that haven't been evaluated. I think when situations are the principal has been unresponsive, the school site has done nothing, I've met with the associate superintendent, and they still aren't responding, is the points when I feel like it's more directed to the superintendent to try to get a response. But I think for me, what like this conversation brings up is like, to my knowledge, I don't feel that we have an effective system for complaint management, complaint intake at our school sites, nor do we have people at school sites who are designated to respond and to address those things in a timely manner, which kind of creates this vacuum of activity that I think we end to looking to the superintendent like, it's your job to make sure everybody is happy. Why isn't everyone happy?
And if I may chime in here too, I think I hear what you're saying, that you're not seeing there's a system that right now, and many community members aren't expressing trust in the system to be able to get a response. But we need to have a system, because I think, from your answers, you can see that a system, it's not going to be an effective system for the superintendent, in this case me, to be responding and following up on every issue that comes in. And so, I'm sure this is the same in San Francisco, like when there's a issue with the contract or parents have a complaint, it's always talked about being addressed at the lowest level. And so how do we, because they're often relational issues, and then they get escalated when it's not at the lower level. So I just hear maybe two things that might be helpful is one, it doesn't sound like there's clarity on like then if it's being addressed at the lowest level, what's the next level up? And where do you go? So that's something that maybe we can help make clear so you know who to redirect to in general areas. And then two, how are we going to, in what ways are we going to start examining, okay, where is our system not working, and then how do we strengthen it and take the systemic approach, knowing like this is an area where then maybe we need to work on.
So the superintendent put forth an idea. And the idea that superintendent put forward is that issues should be, he's actually disagreeing with the board members. He's actually suggesting that issues should be addressed at the lowest level and work their way up. Board members are suggesting that once things are concerned at a campus level from principal and beyond, that it should then be redirected to the superintendent. These are fundamentally incompatible approaches. Board members, you get the final say. What should your procedures be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm saying something totally incompatible. I think the issue that at least I feel like I've experienced both as a board member and as a community member has been that there isn't any expectation of response times. And so I think that is a part of it as well. Like if you are giving people like complaint tickets at their school sites for their issues with an expectation of when they'll be followed up with, I feel like that really lowers the expectation that I have to kind of get involved with things. So I feel like both on the community side through my work at Coleman Advocates, working with student and parent leaders to advocate for change in their schools, and on the board, we see issues that are years long, that are consistent, and all the steps and the actions that are taking aren't leading to resolution. And I think that is what I think I'm hoping to resolve, hoping the superintendent can show me is being resolved so that that we know that the system is working, kind of like what we're lifting up. So I definitely support the idea of a system based at the most introductory level of kind of where we're interacting with students and families. But I just think as a board member, I need to see that that system is working and be able to get feedback from families that they have faith and trust that they're kind of having their issues resolved with.
Other reflections on this?
I see a through line to the need for a system. I mean, part of what's happening is there's not any sort of FAQ, or there's no place to go for families. Like if you look at our website and you try to figure out like who do I contact if I have a question about this or that, it's really opaque. And so it ends up, the emails that you find can be ours if it's something that you feel like needs to, or someone needs to escalate beyond their school site. They feel like they haven't gotten the answers that they want. And so the board needs to have a structure it can lean on and then be trained on how to use that structure. So if I don't want to blow off someone reaching out to me, I want to be able to direct them back to the appropriate way in a consistent way that my fellow board members would also be having the same response, because they similarly know if it's this kind of question, head them this way, or there's just an incredible amount of bird dogging that's done without any sort of case management associated with it. And compounding that, we don't hear as board members from departments that around resolutions, unless it's something that's really inflamed, or types of questions that are being asked that the community would like resolved that staff is having difficulty resolving due to some sort of policy gap and the like. So it's more than just board to community or board to staff, it's also staff to board as well, and feeling that sense of closure and we're all on the same page. There's no routing that happens.
Anyone else reflections on this before we transition?
I would just say, I think like right now, too much falls on principals. And so if a principal is not kind of overachieving or is falling short in some way, it causes there to be a lot of chaos, both in communication and the resolving of issues and problems, as well as the ability for central office to push in and support. And I don't feel like we really have good strategies, at least that I've seen, to really address and to kind of support those issues when the person who's kind of holding it all together isn't able to do that fully.
Okay, so one of the things that I heard is that there is not a clear effective system for complaint management, intake and response. I heard someone reference complaint tickets. Someone said there's not a consistent and effective way to direct people, that there's not case management. And then finally, that too much falls on principals, that there does need to be good internal systems as board communications. So what we'll do is we'll work on that. What comes to mind immediately is, rather than everything going directly from a community member to a board member directly escalated to the superintendent, it sounds like that system has arisen out of systematic failures of the organization to meaningfully track and resolve challenges that families face. And that there needs to be some way of addressing that. I think it's probably going to be suboptimal for that way to be you all as the primary ombudsman of the school system. To be blunt, I find board members to be the absolute worst customer service representatives in any organization. But I agree that there do need to be strong customer service reps. And so with this feedback, I'll try to identify not only what would a more rational system look like, and look at some other districts to see what a rational complaints management system at the district level might look like, but then also then try to identify, if such a thing existed, what would the board's role within that be, and how would that interact? So what's the consistent thing the board could rely on, but also then what's the data that would come back to the board so that you have some confidence that things are actually being addressed, not just going into a vacuum. So that's my takeaway so far with communication with community. That's the direction I'm going to start drafting and send the draft back to you in time for your consideration at your next meeting. Any other reflections on communication with community before we transition?
I do, yeah. I think for us to figure out how to better utilize community as like an agent of getting our communication and message out, and also helping to bring it into us, like I would love for us to figure out a way to hire students and families to support with some of these communications, as well as like this listening and gathering of issues and complaints to kind of help bring them in and just really make it something that's not just about the institution, but about kind of our school community as a whole, and really kind of empowering and bringing folks in specifically to kind of support with the things that they feel most passionate and concerned about in the district.
All right, board members and superintendent, thank you for that. Let's transition to a slightly different topic. What should be the norms that guide communication between board members?
Well, we do have guidelines under the Brown Act. So communication between board members that make up a quorum of a committee or the full board as a whole could be in violation of the Brown Act. So that restricts communication right there amongst board members or between board members. So I'll just leave it at that, but except for, I don't know if you're referencing other districts' best practices, and if you are, maybe you can let us know what you're thinking.
This is just one of the topics that you all surfaced worth discussing. Are there any other specifics? And the Brown Act is kind of a baseline. You don't have a choice. You will comply with that, or I will join others in putting you on blast for not doing so. And so the question really is, are there any things around your communication above and beyond the strictures of the Brown Act that you all feel like should be codified in your expectations of each other?
I mean, I think like we don't have anyone who is like, maybe this isn't the best like reference, but like a sergeant at arms to ensure that we as board members are like treating each other with respect, that we're not raising our voices at each other, you know, things of that nature. Like we don't have that, not necessarily saying that we need that, but I definitely feel like having a way to ensure that we are staying committed to kind of what we have agreed to, as far as how kind of our interpersonal relationships will work and things of that nature.
Building on that, I mean, I think it's baseline, considerate, respectful, and also to the extent that our conversations can be student-focused and really anchor on the work of the board as our communication pertains to board matters. And then working also to strive for no surprises to the extent that we're letting commissioners know about things that are going on or procedural actions that could be shared in advance of board meetings and so forth.
Any other reflections on this idea of communications between board members? All right. The next topic, still in communications, communication with staff who do not report to the board. So ignore your superintendent for a while. We're not talking about your communication with him. We'll come to that. What expectations should the board have of board members' communication with staff who do not report to the board? The floor is open.
I'd like to say that if going even just kind of
Which board member is speaking?
This is Sergeant Smith.
I'm sorry. I think the conversation, I think public comment is closed. I think this is open to board members at this point.
Apologies, AJ, it's been muted.
I misunderstood. I thought the
I apologize for not being more clear about that. Yes, board members, the floor is open. Please, what things should govern communication with staff who do not report to the board?
One thing that comes to mind is not being directive to staff. Again, like
define directive.
So I need a report made based on some issue that's come up. Could you provide that report for me? That would be a directive. It's not coming from the board, it's coming from an individual board member.
What's an example of non-directive communication with staff who aren't the superintendent? So the expectation that I heard described is don't be directive. And so then I asked for an example of what's it look like to be directive. And the example I received was, I need a report made. And that coming from an individual board member, not the board. What's a non-example? What's an example of communication with a staff member that you would consider not directive?
A greeting.
Okay, basic greeting. Anything beyond a basic greeting? Or are we limiting communication between the board members and non-direct reports to greetings? Is there anything beyond greetings that is allowable that would not be directive?
I mean, I seek, on this topic, I really do seek superintendent guidance on how what the best practices would be. I do also want to acknowledge that many of us over the years have developed personal relationships. And so to the extent that those exist, there's also an awareness that we are commissioners. So guidance as to, on this topic, I am seeking guidance.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the challenge, and I appreciate your question, AJ, is that if a board member is initiating communication with the staff member, I mean, to some extent, that is just direction. The staff member is going to feel obligated to respond to a board member. And so I think if the board member is initiating communication, that would come through the superintendent's office, and we would, would determine how to proceed. And I think the most important reason for that is my job is to run the operations of the district. And so, I have an understanding of how staff's time being used and how we're prioritizing it in response to, how we're prioritizing, so it's meeting the needs that our community faces that you want us to address. So for example, like at the start of the year, staff is being focused on making sure that our classrooms are filled. So, if there's a question about an HR process, I would want to be the one to determine whether and how that gets followed up on, because I need HR focused on filling classroom positions right now. And so I think if it's staff, board initiating to staff, it would be through my office. And then AJ, I kind of have a question for you too. I feel like if you have relationships, that's true. If staff's initiating to board, I need to talk with staff of what those parameters are, but it's almost like that's like a community member reaching out. It would almost follow the same guidelines as a community member.
So board members, the superintendent has just said something very significant. And I need to know if you agree or disagree, because it will have a significant impact on what I draft on your behalf. The superintendent said if a board member is initiating interaction with a staff member, that is by definition already directive, because the staff member will feel an obligation to be responsive. Agree or disagree?
I agree. Having worked for commissioners or around commissioners, I definitely felt that way as a staff member. And when I was contacted by commissioners, that moved to the front of the line, regardless of what I was working on and regardless of how important they felt it was. It was just my own personal disposition.
Yeah, I think I don't have an issue with really limiting the communication with the staff that's not the superintendent. I think for me, a lot of the reasons I'm reaching out to additional staff there are questions that haven't been answered fully, or issues that are unresolved that aren't being brought up in any other way. And I feel that the only person with a response is like that staff person. But I think if the superintendent is going to be like the catch-all for those things and like be able to make sure that like they are the place where that stuff is housed, then I definitely feel like it makes sense, right, with that being the person we supervise for us to go through. But I feel like the way the culture is set up here is very, very different, where we work in collaboration with staff on committees and on certain initiatives that sometimes are board directed. So yeah, I guess figuring out, like the balance of that, because I guess I don't want to prevent them from doing work and give directives, but I also don't want to be in a place where I'm uninformed or unable to get answers to questions I have, which is something I feel like they are the answer to currently.
Other board members agree or disagree?
I agree in principle. I think it's really hard in practice, and something that I would be willing to have as a policy. That would mean for me that the superintendent, I would then go to the superintendent, and again, it's just one board member. So depending on how large of my issue is, he may or may not deal with it, because he's like, this is just one board member coming to me for this information, or for some kind of change that I need or want or have a desire for. And so that's, and then if you want, it's a big enough issue for me and I'm not getting an answer, then I'm going to try to get it as a resolution, for a board discussion, which is inappropriate as well. So, or maybe appropriate, but it's just, it gets us away from our main goal here, which is to be student outcome centered.
If I can add,
What do you see as a reasonable solution to the conundrum?
Well, and maybe if I can add two things that might help. So one is we could, then we're setting up processes. So if we do go back to having committees, or I think there would be times where then a staff member is the lead working with you, but it's understood from the beginning. So, that if you're on the budget committee to set up the agenda for that and plan for that, you might be working directly with our head financial officer, and that's understood. So maybe for some working groups or committees, we would have that's clear, but it's understood by everybody. To your second point, I think it's then the way I've worked with boards in the past is this is where, typically a request for information, which is appropriate, like you're saying, Vice President Bogues, to understand things, like that would come through my office, and then unless I then am determining, like, does this seem something that is overly burdensome versus information we can get, and most often it's information we can get, unless it's something like, I'd like an analysis of what's happening at 9 a.m. in every classroom in the district. That would take a significant amount of district resources. I would say, well, I need board direction on that, and so and so I guess that's what I'm saying. I would be then working with the board members on and saying, well, this seems to be where it's more board direction, or it goes on the board agenda, and we're working through that in our communication together. But generally, if it's taking a significant amount of time of staff resources, I would want that where I feel like they need to be on our goals that we've established, and it's not focused on that then becomes a board discussion. But the open communication usually addresses those things.
Yeah, I almost feel like there's a little bit of a cart before horse on this particular conversation, just because as we go through the goals and the guardrails exercise, and we have a cadence of access to data, I feel like a lot of the desire to speak to staff is to get information. And because there haven't been norms around when information might be available, or when resolution may take place, or if we can get the attention, that's where I feel like there's been urgency around staff, a desire to just get the information, because it doesn't seem that hard. But I'm hoping as we have clear priorities and goals and guardrails, and an understanding of what is going to be on our agenda and when we will be seeing particular kinds of data, that will help to alleviate that or reduce the temperature around particular items, and also be more responsive to community members to say, like, I get that, but it's probably not going to be coming up till October or whatever, whatever we can do. But right now, like, our hands are it's a hard beast to get your hands around right now. So that's my one observation in this conversation.
One thing I would add too, I feel like since I've been around like the district, it feels like there has just historically been a practice of not sweeping things over on the rug, but like putting things in the corner, you know what I mean? And then forgetting about them for a long time until like enough people have like deprioritized it where you can kind of slowly exit it out. And I think that also creates a dynamic where when you stop hearing about things, people are more inclined to try to dive into the institution to kind of get more real answers, to kind of see if this is something that is on the way out that they haven't kind of found out about yet, or things of that nature too. So I think just adding that as well.
Let me ask a similar question in a different way. What authority should individual board members have to pursue information from staff who do not respond, who do not report to the board? And this is not an obvious answer, because you want to think through however you respond to this. What authority should individual board members have to expect responsiveness from district staff who do not report to the board?
I don't think that they would be held accountable by me. I think that would be to the superintendent. I think I'm holding the superintendent responsible if I'm not getting access to information and documents. And so I think at least that's the way that it goes to my mind. Like, if his team is unable to deliver me the things that I need, then that is a negative mark on his evaluation and like makes his employment like less viable.
So if you contact a principal, expect information, they don't get it to you, then that is a evaluation issue for the superintendent.
I thought you were talking about like the superintendent's kind of like leadership team, but you're talking about like within the entire district.
Any staff who does not report to the board.
Yeah, like if I reached out to a principal and they were non-responsive, I would probably go to the superintendent next before I tried to hold the principal accountable. But I don't know if that's the heart of the question. Maybe
What if it was a CFO?
it would still be the superintendent to hold them accountable versus me like punishing them or saying they should be disciplined.
Any other board members thought on this? What authority should individual board members have regarding expectations of information from district staff who do not report to the board?
I don't think we have that authority. I think this is why I think in practice, we need to inform the superintendent that we need this information. Or I need this information, if it's me.
Any other reflection on this point before we transition?
Just a clarifying question, AJ, because I'm not just following the logic. If we're saying that they shouldn't be directing, that engaging with staff is pretty much is synonymous with directing staff, and they shouldn't be engaging with staff then in that way unless through the superintendent's office or agreed upon structures, there would be, wouldn't then that mean there's no authority because they're not engaging with staff? They're holding, as Kevin said, Vice President Bogus said, they're holding me accountable if they're not getting the responses that to questions that they shared in my office, but they're not directly going to staff.
Any board members have meaningful quibble with that summary from your superintendent?
I guess to me, I'm parsing the difference of authority versus contact with, because, and I see, and I know what it's like to be staff and to be cognizant that you're speaking with a commissioner. That said, we have been encouraged to have like regular check-in meetings with department heads or so forth, just as they pertain to areas of interest or issues before the board, so we can get ongoing information and be prepped for our board meetings. So one of my questions is if there's an item or a policy or something that we want to be better to better understand or ask questions about, what is the best practice to do that? It's not to direct staff, it's not to say you should do this or should do the other thing, but it's also to be a prepared board member.
But that's what I'm saying, what goes through the superintendent's office, right? So I think that's very fair, because also I can't spend all my time answering questions. So let's say budget's coming forward and, the budget's coming forward and you want to ask some questions about it prior to the board meeting, just have a better understanding. What I'm saying is that process would be going through my office, but then you might be meeting with the head financial officer yourself or in a group of two to not violate the Brown Act. But that's fine. Then in that meeting, then you're not saying, okay, now I need 5 more reports. You're getting information. But I think that would be the system we'd be setting. So when I say things go through the superintendent office, it doesn't mean you never talk to staff, but it means, again, because I see both your needs as well as what staff is doing, think through how to best respond to your needs.
One thing for me too, just saying, I think the need for more transparent, like external communication about the things that we're doing and the way that we're engaging in things. I feel like right now as a board member, I get community members reaching out for me to get explanations about kind of internal district actions and behaviors or things that aren't happening. And it'd be great if there was a public space for that conversation that wasn't a board meeting to allow people to kind of get that information that in my mind should be public and available to them to really kind of understand how things are moving and kind of going forward, to really help build that trust and understanding of how we're approaching things as a district.
When you were speaking, Vice President Bogus, it just, board communication is dependent on district communication, right? So if there's standard district communication happening that is easily understood or readily able to direct community members to, it alleviates the need for us to troubleshoot or create systems. And, likewise, if we know as board members, if there's an item on the agenda that we will have an offer to be briefed 2 weeks before or whatever it is, then that alleviates that need to start pounding the pavement or hearing rumors about what's coming. And so trying to get out ahead of that. So part of this is, I know we're not talking about district practices, but our practices really are, we can write down whatever we want, but it's really dependent on district practices as well.
Any other reflections on communication with staff who do not report to the board before we transition? All right, let's talk about communication with staff who do report to the board. And can someone clarify for me which staff meet that description?
Superintendent and general counsel.
All right. So what are the expectations concerning communication with staff who do report to the board?
Actually, we have a question from the floor, because my understanding is that the general counsel has dual bosses, board.
I'm hoping the general counsel can answer that question.
Yes, the general counsel answers to both the superintendent and the board.
And doesn't also the executive assistant, who do you report to, Mr. Steele?
I officially report to the head of staff. That's who does my evaluation.
That's fairly normative. And so that is a staff person who is assigned to support the board, but there's a distinction between supporting the board and reporting to the board. And so as it is with many school systems across the country, it sounds like the only solid line direct report is the superintendent, and then a dotted line direct report is the general counsel. For the purpose of this conversation, let's prioritize then communication between the board and the superintendent. The floor is open.
Well, generally speaking, superintendents offer up having regular meetings with each board member. So I know that Superintendent Wayne is heading in that direction right now. Are you going to be, is it twice a month for you or once a month?
Twice a month.
Twice a month. So that's one avenue for communication. And it just depends on what the superintendent wants. And if he wants it to be the policy that we contact him when we have an issue, then that would be the other avenue for communication with the superintendent.
And I'd add, I think with the board president, it would be weekly. So the regular communications, and then, well, people can add on to what would be as needed.
Other expectations of communication between board members and the superintendent?
I'll just chime in. I think just since we're talking about communication processes, but I heard you all say a couple of times, I think this would apply to us, that both the no surprises. All right, and we'll determine what constitutes a surprise, because there's a lot of information going in and out. But we got a good example of that, of a recent article that was published that had information that some board members knew and some didn't, and so that's helpful. But I think having a part of the communication is the a sense of you're not going to be surprised about things from me, and vice versa, and that's mutual, that I wouldn't be surprised from you about things.
one thing I think I would add is I think as we have more public communication of data and a regular kind of monitoring calendar, it will like lessen, I think, the like extra questions and like things that I need. But I do feel like an understanding of like what timely communication is and just us having a real clear understanding around that. I feel like right now there are a lot of emergency things that happen, and so we get communicated to very lately. And so I think figuring out how we get as much lead time and how we try to keep communication away from weekends as much as possible as well is like super helpful, I think, for commissioners collectively.
Anything else on this topic before we transition?
I guess one more thing, and I guess this has nothing to do with you, current Superintendent Wayne, but I do feel like I've heard issues with past superintendents in regards to like tone and how they speak to board members and how they relate to board members, and especially like when there's disagreements, not always being respectful of board members. And so I think that's something I think to be aware of, and for us maybe as a board to figure out how we want to hold those situations, maybe in both ways. Like how do we kind of repair harm when those kind of things happen, and like that good communication practices aren't followed or happening.
That's a fair point. It may not go in this particular section, only because this is really around board member behavior, but we may need a parking lot that for a section around superintendent behavior. The basic guidance that I would give the superintendent and board members that you're here is that board members represent the vision and values of the community, and generally speaking are selected by the community. And as such, board members disrespecting other board members or the superintendent disrespecting board members is effectively disrespecting the voice of the community, and is a suboptimal behavior that should be discouraged. So certainly the part about the board's expected behavior with other board members goes here. But I want to add to, I'm adding in my notes to the parking lot that we'll need to revisit this conversation as it relates to what do we expect out of superintendent behavior. Because that'd be, you're correct. The behavior you described is completely unacceptable.
And vice versa, right? I mean, board members have to be respectful to the superintendent in tone and in what we say.
Any other reflections on this conversation before we transition? All right, let's go to an entirely different topic, board meetings and agendas. The first of those is board annual and monitoring calendars. So anything that you want to be said, anything that should be part of your policies or operating procedures as it relates to your annual calendar of activities overall, or your annual calendar, just the monitoring specific portions of it. The floor is open.
I would like an annual calendar.
That would be a nice thing, I think.
We had the sample calendar that we were provided with, which I think is a really good example of how we might want to do things. I think we've expressed enough times that about having our board agenda moving from a 72-hour notice to a much longer notice for both public and for board members, and to have a process. And I think that monitoring calendar actually allows for that. So we
Do you have a recommendation?
That doesn't fully meet our needs because it has the closed session on a separate time.
But you say 72-hour notice moving to what?
Like a 7 to 10 day. I don't know exactly, but this is a 10-day monitoring calendar. So 10 days would be ideal in my mind, I think, to allow for people to give feedback moving forward as they approach the meeting, and then having that feedback or the questions addressed so that it doesn't have to be addressed in the meeting necessarily.
Board members, reflections on this idea of moving from 72-hour notice for board items to 10-day notice for board items. And I want to lift up, this has serious consequences, because what it means is that inside of a 10-day window, you would not be accepting additional items, that they'd need to show up at least 10 days in advance. And things that fall inside of that would need to be postponed to the next meeting. And so there are serious repercussions to this. There are also, as Mark points out, some very serious benefits regarding transparency with the community and the capacity for board members to be adequately prepared for a meeting. What say you? We've heard one recommendation for 10 days. Any other thoughts on this?
I just wanted to say that it does allow for revision, but you're right, that we wouldn't be able to add anything additionally to the agenda. So I'm really interested to hear what Superintendent thinks as well as other commissioners.
No, I think it would be great to have more time for everybody to review. And then I think it would take some time. We need to get that calendar set up first. And then just to start to change our behaviors, and it would mean significant reorganization of, just changing us, staff's work to make sure it's ahead of time. I think the only other thing, something I would want us to consider is some process if something needs to be added within that 10 days that comes up for a real reason. Like, so for example, if we have an RFP out to do something that, the board and everybody agrees to do, but we're not going to get the results until, 10 days right before, but we want to move on this project that it's understood this is going to, it's listed on the agenda, but the contract might not be there till, 5 days before because we needed to finalize the back and forth. But there's like some process for if things come up, we know this is the acceptable way to get it on within those 10 days. And they should not be major issues. They should be more operational issues. Maybe I didn't give the best example, but operational issues of things that would need board approval to get done.
I personally think that there could be exceptions, obviously within 72 hours of the actual board meeting. But I think that I would trust board leadership, our president and vice president, as they do board review or agenda review, to make that call with the superintendent.
So two things. One, I strongly disagree with both of you. I think you will be poorly served to have a long list of exceptions. I think the correct answer is administration will just have to get good at their jobs in this area, and it will take transition time. The second point to that effect is when I see school systems adopt something of this nature, board members should expect a 3 to 4 month period of transition as the superintendent realigns business processes to accommodate for this. This is not even remotely something that you snap your fingers and it magically happens. It is something that will require major realignment of business processes throughout the school system that you can't even possibly imagine would be interrupted by this. But after a full quarter has passed, my recommendation to you would absolutely be not to have exceptions unless effectively a state of emergency is called for. And my experience is the administration figures it out. But I have not heard from other board members on this. And so there may not even be an interest in leaning toward, I think the recommendation that Mark before is 10 days. Other board members, what say you?
I mean, I definitely would prefer to have a longer lead time. I'm agnostic between 7 to 10. If there was anything, any reason to do one versus another, I'd probably be persuaded. But what this suggests to me is the need to work backward and have a real annual calendar where there's a structure and a planning around what it is, especially as we have goals and guardrails and so forth, as far as what is going to come before the board and aligning staff so that they can be prepared rather than a more reactive environment that we currently work in. So I would welcome this longer term planning process and understand that the first quarter and for the first year, I mean, this is a whole different way of doing business operations, but I'm really excited about that. And then also building upon monitoring reports and that kind of work that goes along with it. And then so I'm lumping a lot of things together, but this also aligns with our budget process. And so that our budget process throughout the year is clearly aligned with our priorities. And therefore, when we get to the end, we have a budget that is following the priorities rather than just getting shoehorned into the constraints of what we run into in November or December. So that's another thought. Like this is a whole package of commitment to planning and reorienting around focused work, which means also leaving other things off the table.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think I'm more in like the 7, but I definitely am in like the same like ballpark of like we want to extend it to like a week plus. I think the thing for me is also how much time do we want to give in advance, but also how much time in advance of that noticing that we're giving do we need to ensure that like staff has to get documents translated and prepared and all of the other pieces as well. And just I think figuring out what's best for that and whether it's a 7 or a 10. I definitely would be open to either, but I think I'm more inclined to 7, but I definitely support what Commissioner Sanchez presented first and really feel like it represents what we want to see as a board. I do think it creates a lot of open questions about how we operate now, not fitting into that and kind of what the shift looks like, but definitely ready to examine those questions and solve the issues that arise.
One thing I should point out, bridging off of what Laney surfaced, is that board inserted chaos, which has been a common practice, would absolutely have to be curtailed by this as well. And so if board members showed up and said, we want something on the agenda, it also would be ignored inside of the 10-day window. So just, I put that out there. I don't know if that changes anyone's opinions about the 72 hours or not. Okay, just thought it's worth noting. Any other reflections about the board's calendar, its work monitoring, its priorities? Any other reflections on that before we transition?
Not on it specifically, but I think this may goes back to communication, the importance of there being some communication about the board's calendar and the board's business kind of at the site level and that stuff being accessible at sites. Because I think right now there is really no direct connection between board business and school sites. And so, you know, however, how these calendars are shared at school sites, talked about and engaged with, I think would be an awesome thing for us also to have considered.
I'm not even joking. I don't think the school sites care about the board meetings. As a longtime teacher in this district and a principal.
Okay, it's your job to be optimistic in this conversation, my job to be cynical. Let's stay in our lanes on this one. Couldn't agree more, Mark. Next topic.
Can I just make sure, so I do want to reiterate, because I really want to see a budget approved that aligns with the priorities. And so for me, that is essential. When we talk, because we're talking about board calendar, that to me is a structural, foundational element to how that calendar gets designed.
So yeah, and as we prepared the materials, AJ, because I know you're coming from a different context, there are regular budget reporting cycles and reports that we need to submit. So there should be a rhythm and a sense of how it's building from, first interim to second interim to, then the budget approval and, all those areas. And some of it's dependent on information from the state. So as part of the board calendar, we'll be clear about what, we should be able to get clarity on like what will be coming out about the budget when, and by when you would start to see that alignment.
Right, and how our priorities are reflected in all of those decisions.
All right, next topic, adding and selecting appropriate agenda items. Let's start with the negative. What things should not be added to a board meeting agenda, or how would we know if an item is inappropriate to be added to a board meeting agenda?
I think we're prioritizing student outcomes and monitoring of student outcomes for our board meetings. So I think that would be, one standard, like, does this directly address or deal with student outcomes?
Yes, and I think the goal we are setting for ourselves is 50% of all of our time during board meetings is student outcomes and monitoring, right? And talking about guardrails. So anything that would, tip the scales so that we are not spending the majority of our time on those things, I think would be a determinant for whether that item should be on the agenda or not. So that leaves, to me, I mean, currently the way our agenda is looked at is through our board leadership and the superintendent's team. So I think if we want to continue with that, then they would be the ones who make that judgment.
Do we know what items should and should not be on the board meeting agenda?
I would just say generally, as far as a new policy, I am a fan, and it could be modified, but I like board policy 9310, which is around the policy development process. We don't really do it now that I've seen, but I think it does have thoughtful elements around, I think I wrote it down, like, it's, where the need is identified. There's fiscal and other data, staff and public input, sample policies, other useful information, effect on student learning, community expectations. All those things are before we see a policy, it's gone through an internal process of review, so we understand the impacts to our students, since we're now focusing on student outcomes, but we also understand the financial impacts and the implementation resource impacts and so forth, and community impacts. So I would like that to be considered for consideration.
I'm understanding you correctly. If these things are absent and shouldn't be on the agenda.
Correct.
Anyone else? Reflections about how we would know if something should not go on the agenda? All right, let's reverse the polarity. What should the criteria be for something to be added to the agenda? So somebody calls you and says, hey, I think we should talk about the type of water being served in the boardroom. What is the criteria for whether or not that gets added?
I guess for me, is it something that is an urgent issue that needs to be prioritized in a way outside of, I guess, like the traditional structure of our district? Does that make sense? I mean, I'm thinking of situations where there's an incident at a school site that there is a large demand for like community attention and action on. And that, I guess that those types of things for me seem to need some space to go, and without other spaces existing, like the board meeting seems like a space potentially for that.
Is the board going to take, is there some board action concerning, there was a recent issue that came up in your district around the language that a principal used, and then I think I watched one of your board meetings and there was a lot of public comment around this. Was there a specific board action that the board took on that matter? I didn't think so. All right, so let's use that as an example. Should that have been on a board agenda, yes or no, and why?
No, it's a personnel issue. If anything, it would be on a closed session agenda.
I guess I feel like the opposite of like, it would be good if there was a public way to address the tension and the frustration in the community separate from the personnel issue. And I think the way we're structured right now, the board room is the only place for that. The timing of it also, I think, made it more difficult for that as well.
I mean, my take on that is we have default become the venue. I think I've said this before. I don't think we're the appropriate venue, and I don't think we're the right venue to get it resolved, since that's an administrative matter that is directly under the superintendent's purview and job. What failed to happen or wasn't done enough. I actually don't know enough about that specific example, but what is failing to happen across our system is when there are issues that demand community engagement or merit community engagement, we don't have a clear administrative mechanism to go out into community. So I think that is something, in my read and opinion, it falls under the superintendent's role, and I certainly would like to see that improve, because I think it's total gatekeeping to have it be the board venue when what's happening at a site should be addressed where those people are spending their time and experiencing their frustration.
And I guess I would just add, I think for me, what I'm trying to say is that I do think we should agendize on board meetings issues that are flaring up in the community and that the community wants to see addressed, that they don't feel like they are seeing addressed. But maybe that is not what the rest of the board, like, I guess I'm feeling the, like, where do people come to, like, whistle blow on the things that are concerns or issues that aren't having responses? And I guess that is public comment, and maybe it is a non-agendized time, but I feel like as board members, I guess I'm looking for what is our avenue then, I guess, to make sure that information is shared publicly and availably for everyone else. And I guess we've talked about other venues for that. And I guess this is me struggling with the realization of talking about doing one thing before we do the other. So yeah, okay.
I just think that when it comes to a personnel issue, I mean, I felt really hamstrung in that situation because people were calling on board members to make a declarative statement about racism, right? Or not using the N-word. And we couldn't do that in a board meeting. It was not agendized. But if in a personnel issue, I mean, it's just a slippery slope, and maybe council can weigh in. When we have a personnel issue like that, and it's coming to our attention, and we speak on it, then we could be putting ourselves in a position where we can't actually legally survive in that situation, in a personnel issue like that. So I don't know if you wanted to weigh in or.
No, I agree with that concept, with what you said. I mean, we'd want to be really conservative. We wouldn't want to. I mean, that was one example that was given. There can be all kinds of issues at a site that have nothing to do with personnel, but no, personnel issues should not be agendized in a regular public meeting.
And then, yeah, I think in terms of the what should be on the agenda, I mean, you've already I'm going to summarize a bit, and I would put it in this order. So first and foremost, items related to our work of monitoring progress towards our goals. Two, what we legally need to report on. There's, like I mentioned, the interim reports, and there's various reports we need to do. And I mean, to some extent, it could just be those one or two, and then looking at the board calendar, if there's areas, if there's any other, like I do appreciate there's, recognizing employees. The Rave Awards I've seen are things you do. So, maybe, recognizing, when it's Art is Education Month. So maybe important recognitions that the board has, but other than that, and then, that's three, and then four, just all the operational business of what, that's not required. So I'm making a distinction between what's required and then what we need to do to operate. So like the contracts that need to be approved and those issues. And I really would say, I mean, I'm hearing in this, this is, I guess, my first committee meeting. I'm hearing the concerns about how issues are being addressed. But the board meeting, what I've always been taught is the board meeting is for the board to do the district's business, the board's business in public. Right. And so the more then that's spent on other issues that aren't the board's business, the less time you have to do it. And then you're making incredibly important decisions, like around the budget, which is board business, at 11:30 at night after a long meeting, when, ideally you're making those decisions. And that's the main focus of the meeting. But I hear the need for the systems that support, that are addressing the concerns that you're hearing.
And I agree with you. It's coming up later under this topic around our committees and advisory committees, and that is can be a large part of our board meetings as well. And so I think that we, as a committee here, are going to have to tackle that issue. So we have advisory committees, as you know, that have a standing place on our agendas throughout the year. So migrant ed, American Indian education, and then our special education, our parent advisory council, et cetera. Those are the major ones that come to mind that we could, given a lengthier run up to the meeting, post in various ways, like even if it was a video or a deck for the public and for us, and then have a very shortened actual public meeting because everybody's been exposed to it or had the chance prior to the meeting. That would be a hard sell for obviously for our folks that are doing this volunteer work for us and want to be advisory, and who often feel like that they're not being listened to anyway. So I'm not proposing that we do what I just said, but we definitely need to be looking at that as well.
So, I mean, going back to Vice President Bogus's point too, just about issues that are not being resolved and how they go about. I don't know if it's a parking lot item, but there is this, it does kind of align with the expectations of superintendent behavior, right? And what we can expect as far as the superintendent going out or directing staff to go out into community or to respond to concerns that are being expressed, whether at a school site or otherwise.
You are correct.
And how they get reported back to the board. So whether it's, we hear about it in a board meeting or if that is shared with us internally via weekly updates or whatnot, I think that's important.
You're correct. This is a parking lot item. I've already added to the parking lot. What I put is the superintendent should have public meetings around issues that are superintendent's responsibility, not allow them to default to the board. But that is, again, a parking lot issue because it's talking about board behavior, not superintendent behavior. Let's shift gears a little bit and know that if something comes up for you for any of these topics and you want to go back and have me add something, then just do so. Next topic, design requirements of committees. What are the minimum things that should be present before a committee is instantiated?
I think we're looking at this retrospectively because we already have a lot of committees we're not looking to add anymore. So looking at our committee structure as they are, we have 4 standing committees and 2 ad hoc committees.
And I want to clarify, when I use the term committee, I'm referring to anybody that has been impaneled by this board.
Right, so there's 14 to 17 bodies because they're advisory and otherwise they have different names as well that I think that we should be addressing.
So without focusing too much on what currently exists, my inquiry is around what should be in place before any body of the board is instantiated. Before we authorize any body of the board, what are the bare minimum things that should be in place that all board members should know, that should be publicly known? What criteria should be met before any new body is put into place?
Right, or outside of ones that are legally required for us to have, right? So
so ignore the legal distinction for the time being.
Okay.
Anybody that this board is going to impanel, what are the criteria it should meet before any meeting is ever had?
Well, it should be clear that their role is only to advise the board. If they're board created, it's just to advise the board, not to advise staff. If we're creating the board is creating the committee. There should be a clear scope of work, purpose, deliverables, and a timeline. And it should be aligned with, when we get there, with our goals and guardrails. I kind of see it similar to this ad hoc committee where we understand why we're here, we understand what the deliverables are, and we also understand how our deliverables are going to be used and inform the board.
That is a fairly defined set of criteria the ladies offered. Are there board members who disagree with that? Because that is a fairly constrained set of expectations. I'll read it back. It should be clear that the role is only to advise the board, not to advise the staff or the superintendent. Should be clear scope of work, purpose, deliverables, and a clear timeline, which seems to include an end date. Should be aligned to the goals and guardrails, which will automatically eliminate, frankly, almost everything that bodies of this board currently do, and should be clear how deliverables will be used. Board members and superintendent agree or disagree?
Can I make one distinction? This is
Yes.
about the board-created committees. I also see a role for the district to have its own task force, its own work that would inform staff administrative work. That's welcome feedback.
I think the one thing in there that I would have, I think, pause with is the alignment with the goals and guardrails. Even though I feel like that is it's such a narrow focus, I feel like it would narrow potentially a lot of the interest in the work of some of the like broader groups that we have advising us. I agree around the advisory part, but in my mind that connects back directly to our evaluation of the supervisor. And so how are we really getting this feedback in a way where it's a reflection on the superintendent and his ability to administer, implement, and assess? And so I think figuring out that piece, which I think isn't clear right now, because right now I feel like we get a lot of comments that are really giving us feedback on how programs or individuals or sites are delivering services versus the person who we're actually evaluating and holding directly accountable.
Let me ask this differently, Kevin, before you switch away. Are there items that you've delegated to the superintendent that the board should have a advisory committee on?
Could you ask that one more time?
So there are things that you have delegated to the superintendent. So you've delegated to the superintendent hiring principals. Should the board have an advisory committee on hiring principals?
I don't think we should have a hiring, I don't think we should have an advisory committee on hiring principals.
And so the question then is, why not? What is the line in the sand by which the board should not have a advisory committee, a task force, whatever all your names are? You have a bunch of stuff. I'm not familiar with all of them. So what's the line in the sand beyond which the board should say, no, actually, we would not impanel a body for that purpose?
I guess for me, going back to the principal example, I guess I wouldn't be mad at having like a community advisory committee that was focused on like district hiring practices and promotion practices and how like those things happen versus like how an individual principal got hired or something to that effect. So I don't know if that is me double talking, but I guess that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
Okay, so then what is it about district hiring practices that would cause the board to have an advice? So I'm just trying to get some type of way of knowing when would the answer be yes and when would the answer be no, or could the answer always be yes?
I guess for me, it's like when there are systematic issues that keep reoccurring, whether it's the same issue or it's issues that are stemming from kind of the same place.
So I heard bodies of the board should only be used for systematic issues. And I guess the opposite of that, as opposed to episodic issues. So something that just comes up episodically, you shouldn't have board bodies around that. That should be the superintendent. But things that come up systematically, you're thinking any systematic issue would be eligible for the board to have some type of body around.
That is what I'm thinking.
Got it. Anybody else on this topic? How would you know whether or not you would impanel a body of the board as opposed to deferring to the superintendent to impanel?
For me, the board in panels, a committee, or when we want board policies to be informed by input, which then to me suggests the goals and the guardrails and wants feedback or input, et cetera. When I think about what I would like to see the district take the lead on, I think of things like the LCAP task force. And that is something that is an ongoing effort that does require and benefit from community input and needs to be staffed appropriately on an ongoing basis and requires training or is benefited by training and support of our community members to participate in that process. So to me, that is an example of an administrative, a necessary area for community input and a desired area for community input to carry out our administrative functions, and therefore it would fall under the superintendent's purview. But things around board policy would be informed by a board-created committee such as this one, which is episodic.
So I agree with that. I just had a question. So in your criteria, you included something essentially saying that it's time-bound. So in effect, then that would be that they were all ad hoc. Is that what you're thinking? Okay.
I mean, and I could be convinced otherwise, but it just seems like if it's board policy, then we're regularly updating them. There might, I'm interested in, part of it is wanting to have discrete, clear deliverables that are knowable and clearly reflected by this board in our output. So it's not just an ongoing thing that then people don't feel like it's meaningful.
And the reason I asked that is because then just looking forward to, once we have a policy around, advisory groups that we have already, I mean, basically that'll force us to look at what we already have and then kind of go back and unwind what we've done to meet the criteria. So I'm just thinking about that work and what that looks like.
That is absolutely correct, is that what you all are trying to do is identify not what has emerged from previous dumpster fires, but what would be optimal in terms of governing the school system. And some of the things that you're currently doing are going to match the former description, and some of them will match the latter. Some of them are already doing the optimal work that you would expect bodies of the board to do, and you expect them to continue doing that. But for things where this is born of a episodic circumstance rather than a systemic circumstance, for example, using Kevin's descriptor, that you say, well, no, for the episodic ones, maybe that doesn't make sense for us, and those need to be handed off, but the ones that are serving a systemic purpose, or maybe the ones that are helping inform board level policy should stay with the board, but the ones that are informing administrative regulations should be transitioned to the administration, things of that nature. So yes, whatever decisions you make here, you are trying to describe what is optimal, but then for all existing bodies, what would make the most sense is to go through a review process to identify which ones fit, which ones don't fit. And then from that moment to try to design what is an appropriate transition plan. I generally would not recommend simply snapping your fingers and doing something. That's poor practice. What you need to do is really be thoughtful. What fits the current dynamic, what does not? Which things could be redesigned to potentially fit the new dynamic? Which things cannot? And then for those that can't, what's the timeline for transition process, recognizing you may have a while left on the clock for some to finish out an original purpose before being sunset. But all of that is to come. I think the first step before you think about any of that is what is the optimal way for us to serve the children who are under our care as a board, and then let everything else flow from that, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable. Other reflections on requirements of committees.
I do want to clarify that I'm not suggesting, an elimination. What I am suggesting is what we currently have is not functioning very well for many of our advisories, nor is the work being nor is the work that they're doing being reflected in a meaningful way in much of the work that we do. And so if we're committing, part of what I'm suggesting, especially if it's an ongoing committee, is that it's staffed accordingly and that it's aligned with our purpose as an institution, with student outcomes, with, in the case of the ALCAP, with a document where it's supposed to be getting community input in an effective way, and currently, in my opinion, is not. So it's really about a restructuring as opposed to saying like, this isn't a meaningful concept. Like, this is absolutely a meaningful concept, but I'm not convinced that it's feeling meaningful for many of the people that put so much effort and time and thought and have depth of knowledge. So I want to clarify that.
One of your original points actually speaks to this as well, is that you are the board and people bringing recommendations to you that aren't actually board action are going to be frustrated by the fact that you don't take action on things that aren't board action. Whereas that may be more appropriate for their work to be advising the superintendent rather than advising the board. Or there may be some cases where there are similar bodies, one impaneled by the superintendent to advise administrative work and one impaneled by the board to advise explicitly board work. What I suspect you'll find is other districts who've taken that approach have done. Very few people want to be on the board one because most of the things that people actually care about are actually superintendent work. And so you'll quickly, if you ask people, here are the list of responsibilities for this one that is assigned to the superintendent, and here are the list of responsibilities for this one assigned to the board, pick which one you want to serve on. And boards have found that most people really didn't care about them as much as they thought. I apologize to any board members whose sense of self-importance was harmed in the making of this comment. Any other reflections on committees?
I think just for us to have clear, I don't want to say metrics, but clear idea of like what success looks like for the committees kind of as they're kind of going about their business. I think right now a lot of our advisories are committed with like fixing everything that's wrong in the district, and it puts a big burden on them for the respective area they're advising on. And so I think for us to figure out how to make it manageable, achievable, and have like more time-bound things that they can actually see results of like their input and their hard work, I think will really strengthen the process and strengthen it.
Yeah. All right, let's transition entirely to a whole new topic, addressing concerns.
Actually, AJ, can I go back to the topic before, because I wanted the
Yeah, which one was that?
the design of how items and the design, it's kind of
Agendas.
both. Yeah, agendas. One is, I can't remember, it may have been said, and I'm sorry, I may be repeating, but like ideally no more than 3 to 5 topics for discussion at board meetings. And minimizing the number of board meetings per month is a goal. And we also have talked about putting our closed session up front. Did we? I'm not sure. And so just making sure that's captured. And also, I don't know if we want to have a conversation about public comment and how best to utilize that, or if that's a parking lot item for another day. So sorry to take you back in time, AJ.
No, you're perfectly fine.
And I had a couple things too.
Yeah, go ahead and layer them on.
Okay, just two more things. I think if we're talking about having the agenda prepared ahead of time, appreciate that. Then also the timeline for submitting board questions and getting a response, and so we can work through that. But some suggested that more than just 24 hours before the meeting, and if we're doing it earlier in the week, maybe you get the board agenda on Monday, and then it's a Friday by the time questions are due. So that gives us or Thursday, that gives us Friday and Monday to prepare them. Then the other thing is, and this could be a side maybe this could be for the next one, just something I'm not familiar with from other districts. It seems like agenda items that take board action always need to come twice. Is that accurate? And is that a practice that, or what, and maybe what's the thought process behind the practice, and do we want to examine that?
I can't answer as to the thought process behind it, but that is just our local process that we've adopted. It's not a Brown Act requirement. We do have a first reading requirement. So an item is first put on first reading, it's not discussed, it goes to committee, and then it comes back for second reading and discussion, and then it's voted on.
And then see, then why do things go to committee so that's almost like 3 board meetings for each item, right? Because there's a committee of a whole that it goes to, right?
That is fully the case.
That is true, but to the point, it's that the first reading's taking no time at all. There's no board discussion, there's no public discussion usually. We allow time for it, but nobody ever speaks to it. So in actuality, there's no time. The reason it goes to committee, in my view, is because the committee then vets it. The curriculum committee, if it's a curricular issue, will vet it and give a recommendation to the full board. Likewise, if it's kind of a fiscal impact to the district, then that allows our fiscal team to give that input to the committee instead of having to give that input at a full board meeting and taking more time away from other topics at the full board meeting.
So I guess, thank you for giving the history on that. So while you have the mic, you and anybody else who wants to share, is that the system you want? Do you want to preserve that system going forward, or do you want to do something different?
I'm agnostic.
I think I'm open to change it. I think part of the struggle is resolutions, policy that come before the board don't have the full analysis when they're typically introduced, and that kind of happens through the committee process, through the final board process. So I think if we're able to have, I think, more robust, both like conversation, discussion about the items leading up to it, it'd be something I'm open to. I think the concern is elected boards have a history of sneaking things through on people, whether it's like at that meeting no one comes to, or it's that item on the consent calendar that's number like 87. And so I think just making sure that we're really not moving too quick when we don't have a lot of trust to kind of simplify things without really creating that avenue for dialogue and accountability.
I find it really kind of a contorted process that's hard to follow as a public member when you're acclimating to how this board functions. And one of my concerns about things moving over to committee is those meetings are often not very well attended, and it actually adds another layer of required attendance or participation if someone does want to give input. And then the way our first reading works, it just seems like currently something can show up and it doesn't, there's no clarity of how it appeared or why it appeared or any sort of rigor to do an initial assessment as to whether it makes sense. And I know we're talking about a totally different practice. So to me, this has to do with around introduction of items and what the upfront work is done, alignment of priorities and potential impacts before it takes up full board time and therefore the general public's time. So I am open to how to do this better, but I will note I haven't found committees to be particularly well attended unless there's an item of such great interest, in which case it almost seems like a board meeting is. Yeah, a committee of a whole is merited anyhow for that particular item.
So one thing that I would highlight is it sounds as if you've used the first meeting, committee meeting, second meeting structure as a way of trying to bolster transparency and accessibility for community members to understand what's going on and have an opportunity for a voice. Am I characterizing that accurately? That is one way to accomplish that. There are plenty others. One of the other very common ways is one that you've already lifted up, this idea of simply making all of the information available to the public 10 days in advance, and creating an avenue for community members to be able to communicate with their board members inside of that 10-day window far in advance of the board meeting. as I'm thinking about ways to honor what you all have experienced while trying to help transition to what you all want, one idea that comes to mind, and I'll have to do some research to see how many other boards operate this way, is having things clearly show up on an agenda after this 10-day period, but there being some type of systemized way where if board members feel as if an item simply needs a greater degree of review, that it can be easily nudged to a subsequent meeting. So essentially, having a consent agenda, a regular agenda, and then a future agenda, and that everything starts life on the consent agenda, but then board members can request things either be placed on the regular agenda if you think it should be considered at this meeting, but should be voted on separate from the consent, or things could be requested to be moved to the future agenda, which is a board member's way of saying, I think as a board, we aren't going to be ready this meeting, but I think we will be ready next meeting. And so I'm trying to think of how to bridge the gap between what your past practice has been and what I'm hearing you all describe as your current. And so just know that I'm trying to synthesize this in some ways that may wind up being novel just for you all, because you do have some uniquely derived practices that I'm trying to honor while also honoring the new things you want as well. Other reflections about this before we go back to addressing concerns?
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just say, it sounds like you have some things to think about, AJ. And I also think this is where just in hearing, thank you for the background on this, and hearing some of the background, this is where maybe the guardrail that it seems like we're going to adopt around plans will not be brought forward without meaningful community engagement, however we define that. If that guardrail is really in place and followed through on, there can be more confidence knowing that whatever plan is brought forward already has been through a community vetting process. And you don't need to have the board be the place where it's like first read, goes to committee, comes back. So just share, so as you develop this, AJ, I think, I see the connection there with our guardrails.
Yeah.
And there's also the option, I think, to put things on as informational items as well. Like it doesn't have to just be on there for a vote. So there's that latitude. And then we have also talked about just trying to move as many of the items as possible to the consent.
Yeah, and last thing, and I'm fine, totally fine with this. All this is going to mean is just we're doing fewer things, which I think will be a good thing. Right, just because it will need to be much more planned when bringing forward items and taking action on them, and having but I think that's a good thing.
And maybe not at this meeting, but the next meeting we could talk a little bit more about that idea of pulling something from the consent for discussion, and whether there needs to be a threshold of amount of commissioners that would request that for that to happen, or just have one commissioner. I don't know the answer to that.
Any recommendation?
I don't. I mean, I think I prefer a threshold. I just don't know what that should be.
Gotcha. All right, let's go back to addressing concerns. Fortunately, a lot of the items that were in here have partially been addressed in previous conversation. So board member concerns regarding behavior of staff who don't report to the board. How should those be addressed? And again, we've already touched on this a little bit, but how should board member concerns regarding behavior of staff who don't report to the board be addressed? What should board members do if you have concerns about staff who don't report to the board?
To me, that would be going through the superintendent, who is the one person who does report to the board.
All right, well, that was quick, and I'm hearing no other comments. Is that pretty much it? All right. How about board member concerns regarding behavior of staff who do report to the board? And again, for this, even though there are two of them, let's just focus on the superintendent. So board member concerns about superintendent performance. How should those be handled?
I think if a board member has a concern, they should address the superintendent with that concern. And if it's a big enough concern that it's about his contract, then it goes to closed session under personnel.
And that I would add, raising it through the board president first.
That's true.
Before or after talking to the superintendent?
I would think that I personally would want to address it with the superintendent. And then if I felt dissatisfied with the result, I would go to the board president.
That seem reasonable to folks? What role does Twitter play in board member concerns regarding superintendent performance?
I'm not on Twitter.
Do you want a whole number or a percentage?
Yeah, so the underlying question here is, you have a concern about superintendent performance. Under what circumstances should anyone know about that prior to these first two steps occurring? Step one, talk to the superintendent. Step two, raise with the board chair, which it can then go to closed session under personnel items. So under what circumstance should any board member concerns about superintendent performance follow any pattern other than those two steps first?
I guess they shouldn't. Not first. I mean, I think if those things don't happen, I think it creates different like alternative paths. But I think those are the channels and the avenues for us to start with to address those concerns outside of the evaluation process.
This is a major shift in behavior. So I just want to put this out here again. If a board member has a concern about superintendent performance, under what circumstances is appropriate for them to air that in any venue if they have not yet first talked to the superintendent about it, and second, raise the issue with the board chair, who can then call a closed session to discuss it under personnel? If those two steps haven't been followed, under what circumstances should a board member be public with their concerns around superintendent performance?
If the superintendent broke the law.
All right, so we find out that Matt is smuggling laptops, out at night. Then post that on Facebook and Instagram just to be safe for Mark, prior to raising this with the superintendent.
Yeah, we should raise with superintendent first. I would correct that answer.
Okay, just checking. This is a serious thing, because the next question that we're going to talk about is board member concerns regarding board member performance. So the question is going to be, what happens when board members don't adhere to this particular expectation? So before we get to what happens when board members don't honor the expectations, any other thoughts? Under what circumstances should board members go public with concerns about superintendent performance prior to discussing with the superintendent, discussing it with the board? All right, hearing none, like I said, we can always come back to prior topics. Let's go to the next topic, which is how should it be handled when board members have concerns about board member behavior? What should the steps be?
I think that I should, if it was me, approach the board president. Unless it's the board president that I have a concern with, then I'm kind of stuck. Then I might go to the vice president.
All right, so if Jenny's messing up, go to Kevin. Got it.
Yeah.
I think trying to figure out how we can establish some like direct communication when there's conflict and some way to go about it. I'd love to talk to the superintendent about us developing a way to access some of the district's restorative practices and the restorative practice coaches to potentially also be another way to kind of help de-escalate and mediate conflict kind of amongst the board. And figuring out like whether that's a public process or something else that would allow us to both kind of model and demonstrate like the power of restoring relationships when things happen that aren't positive.
Lean toward a restorative process. All right, so you've had a so we've aired our concerns with the board member, nothing changed. We talked to the board chair, they can talk to the board member, nothing has changed. So we've tried to take this restorative approach first, then what happens?
I think it just depends on the level of concern amongst the rest of the board. If it's an issue where it's causing a lot of consternation with a lot of boards, the ultimate thing can be a censure. I mean, those are really extreme cases, but that ultimately can happen.
Can somebody define for me what does censure mean for you all?
It's the process is that it comes to the board as an actual action item that has, you know, the whereas clauses describing what the board member did or didn't do, and then I think it's called a censure. Basically, they vote to censure. Now, we obviously in a more recent case, we've had, you know, a board member that the board voted to remove that board member from committee status and their vice chair position. So there are different avenues to take. It just depends on how egregious the behavior is.
So some of their board member privileges were then revoked. Other thoughts about how it should be handled when board members have concerns regarding board member behavior? And I want to reiterate, this is particularly important because everything we've talked about so far today, except for the four parking lot items I have, are about expectations of board member behavior that, if not honored, then become eligible for this process. So any other thoughts about how board members should address concerns about board member performance and board member behavior?
I think that what we shouldn't do, and I think you alluded to it, or you did ask about it in the previous session or section, was do we go on Twitter or social media? And
I was coming to that question.
Okay, because I prefer that we don't do that.
Thoughts about that, board members? Under what circumstance should you go public with your concerns about board member behavior prior to going through these steps? I'm asking anyone other than Kevin. Under what circumstances should board members go public with their concerns around board member behavior prior to going through these steps?
And can you outline the steps one more time?
I essentially have 4 steps here. First, talk to the board member. Second, talk to the board chair, who can then, you know, talk to the board member, maybe even have a 2-on-1, but essentially using a restorative process is what I was trying to capture from what Kevin was saying. The next, bring it to the full board for discussion. And if the board feels like it warrants it, that if things aren't resolved by the full board conversation, then step 4 is, if there's still a concern, bring forward a potential formal action such as a censure. Censure comes to the board as an action item, whereas clauses describing allegations has the impact of removing the board member's privileges.
And it doesn't necessarily have to have that impact. It could be just a censure, or it could include removing, it just depends on how egregious I think the situation is. It could include removing privileges from that board member.
Gotcha. Could have.
I'm struggling with this one. I have to say I'm struggling with this one as far as the steps.
It's the tough issue.
The first steps and the last steps.
I am not at all struggling with alerting the board president and even in some cases alerting the superintendent, because it is potentially impactful to the district as a whole when board behavior is out, and I'm talking about outside of the boardroom. And we all are on the board together, and one of us saying hurtful and I mean, I know we've all lived it, so saying really harmful things by default reflects upon the rest of us. And so it becomes really difficult in the public sphere to manage other people's behavior that is reflecting upon you in a productive and meaningful way for student outcomes, keeping the focus on the work that we all have so collectively committed to. So I am having, my question is, in the public sphere, when we get drawn into it and we've communicated, gone through those channels, I don't have, I guess it's not a question. I'm just acknowledging the incredible difficulty because there is a desire for response, whether it's agreement, distance, something else. And frankly, to your point, Vice President Bogus, there's a real desire for healing and restoration and coming together as a community. And so finding the path forward where we can do that and we can respond, because silence in the public sphere when someone else has taken that step can be misconstrued as acquiescence or acceptance, when it absolutely 100% is anything but. So that is my, I'm learning that path. Others have gone before me. I am upon that journey now. And it's a very difficult needle to thread, especially when the whole purpose that we are giving this time to this district is for the students and for their students' outcomes and supporting the families and educators that are invested in seeing us do a good job.
So the note that I've put in here, and I'll have to think about this, so don't expect this to be in the final because I've never written something quite like this. But the note that I put here is that if a board member has violated this expectation, so they're out saying something negative about another board member without going through this process, the board chair may communicate this process, the name of the board member who has violated it, and clarify other board members are not discussing it publicly because they're choosing to continue honoring the policy, even in the face of one board member not honoring it. So something, because the concern I hear you saying is, so somebody's going out and saying, well, AJ is doing these horrible things, but my only real way to, clap back at that might be to then also violate the policy. And so in that moment, is there a mechanism where the board chair or whoever needs to be the presiding person for that scenario can say, hey, public, here's the situation. This person, is having this communication public in violation of our operating norms. The board member who's subject to it is not responding publicly only because they are trying to honor our norms. We will go through our process and then we'll have a public statement at the conclusion of that process. Something that even though I'm being talked about and I'm not going to respond because that would violate process, but ideally my board chair would clarify for folks, hey, here's why AJ's not responding is because that other thing shouldn't have been said. And so AJ's not going to try to create a right out of two wrongs. Something like, would something of that structure address some of your concern, Lainey?
It would. And I want to acknowledge the position that puts the board president in, as well as the rest of the board.
I don't worry about that. She signed up for it. Yeah, so to be clear, all of this creates significant burden on the board chair, and that's just the nature of why you are clever not to volunteer to be the board chair. I had to go through this. I had to go through a censure process with one of my board members when I was board chair, and I didn't like it either. But that's the nature of the beast. Any other reflections on board member concerns about board member behavior or performance? Well, we went 15 minutes in overtime. Madam Committee Chair, I apologize for that. So, my team, we have enough notes from this meeting. What will happen next is we will take all of these notes, we'll do research with other school boards across your state, as well as across the nation, other large urban districts, and try to put together a set of draft procedures for your consideration, some that will leverage existing language that's in your policies and procedures, some that will be entirely brand new. And so where it is modifying existing, then we will try to red line the existing things. Where it's brand new, we'll just indicate that this is all new. This doesn't modify anything else. Our intention to fulfill your timeline is to complete that task with my team, get that to your legal, and then have that back to board 7 days prior to the 3rd, which I think is probably next Wednesday or Thursday. Somebody will check the calendar. But our intention is to have that back to you so that it can be publicly posted, so that not only this committee, but the full board, as well as your entire community, can see that early draft. It is not our expectation that that is the final draft. It's our expectation that that really fuels the next conversation on the 3rd, where then you can receive more public comment, more comments from your colleagues, more edits to that draft, which then hopefully sets you up for success by your 3rd meeting for the 3 of you as a committee to finally just hammer away at that. And so just know that there's no pride of ownership here. We're simply putting together a draft with the hopes that it will help you get you closer to what you think is in the best interest of serving in your roles. If there's nothing else, Madam Chair, back to you.
The only thing I would add to that is my understanding also is any recommended edits from committee members or fellow commissioners should be submitted to AJ and his team no later than 72 hours prior to the 2nd meeting. And the public is welcome to submit comments as always. Those can be done in writing, and we'll also have the opportunity to comment in person as well as we always do. Our email is boardoffice@sfusd.edu. Oh, and Vice President Pogus.
Just one last thing I wanted to mention that didn't come up. I would love for us to figure out a way to have the presentations from staff be videotaped in advance and be made available to the public before the board meetings. I feel like just figuring out a way to really extend the transfer of information beyond just the individual documents being posted in the PowerPoints. So that was all. Thank you so much for that addition.
And I just wanted to add one thing. We didn't really talk about it, so we probably want to next time, is public comment during board meetings.
Is there a particular comment you have about public comments?
I do. I think that we should be looking at what other districts are doing. I think that there are some districts that bundle their public comment toward the beginning of the meeting for all agenda items. And then assuming that our board meetings are truncated because of all of these changes, then you put non-agenda public comment at the end of the meeting. And we moved it up to the beginning a long time ago because our meetings are so long and we don't want kids and others to have to wait till the end of the meeting to have public comment on non-agenda items. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to truncate our meetings so that we can then look at that as an option. So
yeah, and I would say I can definitely get you all a survey of what about 20 or 30 other large urbans do and provide that in addition to the recommendations we provide, so that you'll have just some samples of what other large urban districts are doing in this regard. And then you could see if one of those practices matches, and then whatever you all choose, we can insert into your policies. To Kevin's point, actually, and to yours, Mark, my board actually does both of those. Our board meetings, we have public comments on agenda items at the beginning and public comments on non-agenda items at the end. And Kevin, we get our board items for my district, we get our items 14 days in advance. And we basically put a ban on PowerPoints, to your point, at board meetings. Like, you don't need to come read us a PowerPoint at a board meeting, we're grown. Instead, staff records YouTube videos, and those are attached to our items 14 days in advance. Community can watch them, we can watch them, whoever can watch them. But then there are basically almost no presentations at our board meetings. It's really a time for generative discussion and deliberative dialogue among board members and the superintendent, more so than a time for extensive presentation making. But that's something you all will have to decide, kind of what the design of your how you want your time spent during your board meetings. I've captured those comments and will bring you all options regarding those items as well.
I just have one last one, and this is that Jenny has been implementing in the last couple of meetings, which is how the board discusses items. And I don't know if we want to codify that, but basically in our rules and policies, but basically having, a round of comments from the board as a whole. And then if there's a certain amount of board members that want to have another round, the president of the board allows for that. So I don't know if we want to discuss that later or if we want to codify it, but I do personally think it's a really good practice.
Yeah,
I like it as well.
I've had several of the boards I've supported move to that, and they have enjoyed the impact it's had on forcing board members to be thoughtful and not rambling. Any other reflections before I sign back off? Madam Chair, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for spending an extra 21 minutes, according to 19 according to that clock, 21 according to that clock. And with that, I will say that this meeting is adjourned at 7:21 according to my laptop. Thank you so much.
Well done.
Thank you for your help at the beginning with the, yeah. Because that's the stuff I tune out when I'm sitting there, so I'm like, wait, what's